mill around. Of course, the lone UFO that took off to the east by itself was the biggest argument against balloons. Newhouse told an intelligence officer from the Western Air Defense Forces that he had held his camera still and let this single UFO fly through the field of view so the people in the lab measured its angular velocity. Unfortunately, there were no clouds in the sky, nor was he able to include any of the ground in the pictures, so our estimates of angular velocity had to be made assuming that the photographer held his camera still. Had the lone UFO been 10 miles away, it would have been traveling several thousand miles an hour. The Air Force Photo Lab at Wright Field gave up. All they had to say was, "We don't know what they are, but they aren't airplanes or balloons, and we don't think they are birds." While the lab had been working on the movies at Wright Field, Major Fournet had been talking to the Navy photo people at Anacostia. They thought they had some good ideas on how to analyze the movies, so as soon as we were through with them, I sent them to Major Fournet, and he took them over to the Navy lab. The Navy lab spent about 2 months studying the films and had just completed their analysis. The men who had done the work were on hand to brief the panel of scientists on their analysis after the panel had seen the movies. We darkened the room, and I would imagine that we ran each film 10 times before every panel member was satisfied that he had seen and could remember all of the details. We ran both films together so that the men could compare them. The Navy analysts didn't use the words interplanetary spacecraft when they told of their conclusions, but they did say that the UFOs were intelligently controlled vehicles and that they weren't airplanes or birds. They had arrived at this conclusion by making a frame-by-frame study of the motion of the lights and the changes in the light's intensity. When the Navy people had finished with their presentation, the scientists had questions. None of the panel members were trying to find fault with the work the Navy people had done, but they weren't going to accept the study until they had meticulously searched for every loophole. Then they found one. In measuring the brilliance of the lights, the photoanalysts had used an instrument called a densitometer. The astronomer on the panel knew all about measuring the density of an extremely small photographic image with a densitometer because he did it all the time in his studies of the stars. And the astronomer didn't think that the Navy analysts had used the correct technique in making their measurements. This didn't necessarily mean that their data were all wrong, but it did mean that they should recheck their work. When the discussion of the Navy's report ended, one of the scientists asked to see the Tremonton movie again, so I had the projectionist run it several more times. The man said that he thought the UFOs could be seagulls soaring on a thermal current. He lived in Berkeley and said that he'd seen gulls high in the air over San Francisco Bay. We had thought of this possibility several months before, because the area around the Great Salt Lake is inhabited by large white gulls. But the speed of the lone UFO as it left the main group had eliminated the gulls. I pointed this out to the physicist. His answer was that the Navy warrant officer might have thought he had held the camera steady, but he could have panned with the action unconsciously. This would throw all of our computations way off. I agreed with this, but I couldn't agree that they were seagulls. But several months later, I was in San Francisco waiting for an airliner to Los Angeles, and I watched gulls soaring in a cloudless sky. They were riding a thermal, and they were so high that you couldn't see them until they banked just a certain way. Then they appeared to be a bright white flash, much larger than one would expect from seagulls. There was a strong resemblance to the UFOs in the Tremonton movie. but I'm not sure that this is the answer. The presentation of the two movies ended Project Blue Book's part of the meeting. In 5 days, we had given the panel of scientists every pertinent detail in the history of the UFO, and it was up to them to tell us if they were real, some type of vehicle flying through our atmosphere. If they were real, then they would have to be spacecraft, because no one at the meeting gave a second thought to the possibility that the UFOs might be a super-secret US aircraft or a Soviet development. The scientists knew everything that was going on in the US, and they knew that no country in the world had developed their technology far enough to build a craft that would perform as the UFOs were reported to do. In addition, we were spending billions of dollars on the research and development and the procurement of airplanes that were just nudging the speed of sound. It would be absurd to think that these billions were being spent to cover the existence of a UFO-type weapon. And it would be equally absurd to think that the British, French, Russians, or any other country could be far enough ahead of us to have a UFO. The scientists spent the next 2 days pondering their conclusion. They reread reports and looked at the two movies again and again. They called other scientists to double-check certain ideas that they had, and they discussed the problem among themselves. Then they wrote out their conclusions, and each man signed the document. The first paragraph said, "We as a group do not believe that it is impossible for some other celestial body to be inhabited by intelligent creatures. Nor is it impossible that these creatures could have reached such a state of development that they could visit the Earth. However, there is nothing in all of the so-called flying saucer reports that we have read that would indicate that this is taking place." The Tremonton movie had been rejected as proof, but the panel did leave the door open a crack when they suggested that the Navy Photo Lab redo their study. But the Navy lab never rechecked their report, and it was over a year later before new data came to light. After I got out of the Air Force, I met Newhouse and talked to him for 2 hours. I've talked to many people who have reported UFOs, but few. I learned that when he and his family first saw the UFOs, they were close to the car, much closer than when he took the movie. To use Newhouse's own words, "If they had been the size of a B-29, they would have been at 10,000 feet altitude." And the Navy man and his family had taken a good look at the objects. They looked like two pie pans, one inverted on the top of the other. He didn't just think the UFOs were disc-shaped, he knew that they were. He had plainly seen them. I asked him why he hadn't told this to the intelligence officer who interrogated him. He said that he had. Then I remembered that I'd sent the intelligence officer a list of questions I wanted Newhouse to answer. The question, "What did the UFOs look like?" wasn't one of them, because when you have a picture of something, you don't normally ask what it looks like. Why the intelligence officer didn't pass this information on to us, I'll never know. The Montana movie was rejected by the panel as positive proof because even though the two observers said that the jets were in another part of the sky when they saw the UFOs, and our study backed them up, there was still a chance that the two UFOs could have been the two jets. We couldn't prove the UFOs were the jets, but neither could we prove they weren't. The controversial study of the UFO's motions that Major Fournet had presented was discarded. All of the panel agreed that if there had been some permanent record of the motion of the UFOs, a photograph of a UFO's flight path or a photograph of a UFO's track on a radar scope, they could have given the study much more weight. But in every one of the 10 or 20 reports that were offered as proof that the UFOs were intelligently controlled, The motions were only those that the observer had seen, and the human eye and mind are not accurate recorders. How many different stories do you get when a group of people watch two cars collide at an intersection? Each of the 50 of our best sightings that we gave the scientists to study had some kind of a loophole. In many cases, the loopholes were extremely small, but scientific evaluation has no room for even the smallest of loopholes, and we had asked for a scientific evaluation. When they had finished commenting on the reports, the scientists pointed out the seriousness of the decision they had been asked to make. They said that they had tried hard to be objective and not to be picayunish, but actually all we had was circumstantial evidence. Good circumstantial evidence, to be sure, but we had nothing concrete, no hardware, no photos showing any detail of a UFO, no measured speeds, altitudes, or sizes, nothing in the way of good, hard, cold scientific facts. To stake the future course of millions of lives on a decision based upon circumstantial evidence would be one of the gravest mistakes in the history of the world. In their conclusions, they touched upon the possibility that the UFOs might be some type of new or yet undiscovered natural phenomenon. They explained that they hadn't given this too much credence. However, if the UFOs were a new natural phenomenon, the reports of their general appearance should follow a definite pattern. The UFO reports didn't. This ended the section of the panel's report that covered their conclusions. The next section was entitled Recommendations. I fully expected that they would recommend that we at least reduce the activities of Project Blue Book, if not cancel it entirely. I didn't like this one bit because I was firmly convinced that we didn't have the final answer. We needed more and better proof before a final yes or no could be given. The panel didn't recommend that the activities of Blue Book be cut back, and they didn't recommend that it be dropped. They recommended that it be expanded. Too many of the reports had been made by credible observers, the report said. People who should know what they're looking at. People who think things out carefully. Data that was out of the circumstantial evidence class was badly needed, and the panel must have been at least partially convinced that an expanded effort would prove something interesting, because the expansion they recommended would require a considerable sum of money. The investigative force of Project Blue Book should be quadrupled in size, they wrote, and it should be staffed by specially trained experts in the fields of electronics, meteorology, photography, physics, and other fields of science pertinent to UFO investigations. Every effort should be made to set up instruments in locations where UFO sightings are frequent so that data could be measured and recorded during a sighting. In other locations around the country, military and civilian scientists should be alerted and instructed to use every piece of available equipment that could be used to track UFOs. And lastly, they said that the American public should be told every detail of every phase of the UFO investigation, the details of the sightings, the official conclusions, and why the conclusions were made.